The decision did not arrive wrapped in theory or announced as doctrine. It took the form of a directive, narrow in scope and framed as a correction rather than a transformation. A set of trade measures was authorized, justified as temporary leverage, described as reversible if conditions improved. At the time, it was presented less as a reordering of the global system than as a negotiation tactic, a way to reset terms that had drifted unfavorably. Many observers treated it accordingly as a sharp but limited intervention within an otherwise stable framework. In the early months, the effects appeared contained. Markets absorbed the news. Supply chains adjusted at the margins. Businesses complained, then adapted. The global economy, accustomed to episodic disruptions, incorporated the new reality into forecasts without revising its deeper assumptions. The prevailing belief was that the system itself remained intact, that pressure could be applied without altering the architecture through which trade, finance, and power flowed. This belief rested on long experience. For decades, similar measures had been used without lasting structural consequence. Yet, decisions taken at the center of large systems rarely remain local. Their significance lies not only in their immediate outcomes, but in the signals they send to those who must operate within the system over time. Even when framed as tactical, they invite interpretation. They force institutions to ask not whether the policy will succeed, but what it implies about the future reliability of the environment in which they function. These questions are rarely answered publicly. They are addressed quietly through planning documents and contingency models. The earliest responses to the pressure were practical rather than ideological. Firms examined their exposure. Governments reviewed dependencies that had once seemed unproblematic. Financial institutions reassessed assumptions about continuity. None of this suggested panic or rejection. It suggested recalibration. Systems that have worked well for a long time tend to generate habits of trust. When those habits are interrupted, even briefly, the interruption itself becomes data. History shows that economic pressure campaigns often operate on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, they aim to extract concessions or alter behavior in the short term. Beneath that, they test the elasticity of the system they rely on. If the system absorbs the pressure without significant adaptation by others, leverage is reinforced. If it prompts diversification and insulation, leverage diminishes, even if immediate objectives are met. This second effect is slower and harder to measure, which is why it is frequently underestimated. Long before modern trade disputes, empires learned that control exercised through commerce carries inherent risks. When access to markets or financial channels is used as a tool, it encourages those subject to that tool to seek alternatives. At first, those alternatives are inefficient and costly. Over time, investment and repetition improve them. The original system remains dominant, but its monopoly weakens. This dynamic has unfolded repeatedly, often unnoticed, until the balance has already shifted. In the present case, the decision to apply sustained economic pressure signaled a change in how power might be exercised in the future. It suggested that the rules governing trade and finance were more contingent than previously assumed. For actors whose prosperity depended on predictable access, this contingency mattered more than the specific measures themselves. It introduced a variable that couldn't be easily priced or hedged: policy uncertainty, embedded at the systemic level. As the months passed, attention remained focused on visible outcomes: trade volumes, tariff revenues, headline negotiations. Less attention was paid to the quieter adjustments taking place alongside them. Supply chains began to reroute, not only to avoid immediate costs, but to reduce exposure to future ones. Investment decisions incorporated political risk in ways that had not been necessary before. These shifts did not reverse existing relationships, but they altered their trajectory. Only later did the broader strategic implications become clearer. Economic pressure, when applied by a central node in the global system, does more than constrain a target. It communicates that participation in the system carries conditions that may evolve unpredictably. For some, this reinforces compliance. For others, especially those with sufficient scale, it incentivizes autonomy. The difference lies not in ideology, but in capacity. Those who can afford to adapt will do so quietly. At this stage, modern politics enters the frame, not as spectacle, but as context. The measures were associated with the presidency of Donald Trump, but their deeper significance transcended any single administration. They reflected a shift in willingness to use economic interdependence as leverage. This willingness did not originate in isolation, nor did it end with one term. It marked a recognition that the existing order could be actively shaped rather than passively inherited. The strategy, viewed historically, fits a familiar pattern. Dominant powers often turn to economic tools when military or diplomatic options appear constrained. These tools promise influence without overt conflict. They are attractive precisely because they operate within existing systems, yet their use alters perceptions of those systems. What was once seen as neutral infrastructure begins to look like an instrument of policy. Trust, once eroded, is difficult to restore fully. By the time this realization settles in, the immediate debate has usually moved on. New issues command attention. Markets stabilize. The absence of crisis is taken as validation, but the structural effects persist, accumulating quietly. Decisions made in response to perceived vulnerability harden into policy. Temporary workarounds become permanent features. The system adapts, but not always in ways that preserve its original balance. This is the foundation on which the later consequences rest. The strategy behind the pressure campaign cannot be understood solely by its stated goals or immediate results. It must be examined as a signal sent into a complex system with a long memory. Such systems respond slowly, but they remember. When they adjust, they do so in ways that are difficult to reverse, even when the initial pressure is removed. At the end of this opening phase, nothing appears broken. Trade continues. Finance flows. Institutions function. That is precisely what makes the strategy's deeper implications easy to overlook. The most consequential changes are still forming below the surface, where they rarely attract attention until they have reshaped the terrain itself. When economic pressure is examined over long spans of history, its effectiveness is rarely determined by force alone. It depends on structure. Pressure works best when applied within a system that remains trusted, centralized, and difficult to escape. The moment those conditions weaken, the pressure still registers, but its strategic value changes. It becomes a catalyst rather than a constraint. This distinction is central to understanding how such campaigns reshape the environment they operate within. Across empires and eras, dominant powers have periodically discovered that economic tools offer an appealing substitute for direct confrontation. They appear cleaner, more precise, and less visibly destructive. Trade restrictions, financial controls, and access limitations promise influence without overt conflict. In the short term, they often succeed. Targets adjust behavior, markets respond, and the initiating power reads compliance as validation. The deeper pattern, however, unfolds on a different timeline. The mechanism is not resistance, but adaptation. Systems exposed to sustained pressure begin to internalize the risk of dependence. At first, the response is defensive. Redundancies are built. Alternative suppliers are tested. Legal structures are examined for points of vulnerability. These actions are framed as prudence, not defiance. They attract little attention because they do not disrupt existing flows. They simply add parallel ones. Over time, these parallels acquire substance. What began as contingency planning becomes operational reality. The original system remains in use, but it is no longer singular. This is the moment when pressure loses its asymmetry. The initiator still possesses power, but that power now competes with the target's growing ability to absorb or reroute it. Historically, this phase has marked the beginning of strategic dilution. Empires that relied heavily on economic leverage have encountered this pattern repeatedly. In earlier centuries, control over trade routes and financial centers conferred immense influence. Yet, when access was restricted too visibly, merchants and states invested in alternatives. New routes were opened, new instruments developed, new alliances formed. None of these changes overturned the old order immediately. They simply ensured that future pressure would encounter resistance not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The pressure campaign directed at China followed this familiar logic, whether intentionally or not. Its immediate mechanisms were clear enough. Tariffs, restrictions, and targeted measures sought to alter incentives and behavior. The strategic assumption underlying them was that integration had created sufficient dependence to make adjustment costly and compliance preferable. This assumption was not unreasonable. For decades, integration had deepened without serious interruption. What changed was the perception of permanence. Once pressure is applied, integration no longer appears unconditional. The system reveals itself as contingent, subject to political recalibration. For actors operating within it, this realization matters more than the specific policies enacted. It reframes risk. The question shifts from how to optimize within the system to how to survive outside it, if necessary. Numbers alone do not capture this shift. Trade volumes may fluctuate without collapsing. Investment flows may slow without reversing. These indicators often reassure observers that the system remains resilient. Yet structural change does not require contraction. It requires redirection. Even modest reallocation, if sustained, alters future pathways. Capital invested in alternatives does not disappear when pressure eases. It remains, shaping decisions long after the initiating policy has changed. This is why historical mirrors are instructive. In prior transitions, dominant powers often mistook continued participation for continued dependence. They observed that others still traded, still borrowed, still settled in familiar ways, and concluded that leverage remained intact. What they missed was the gradual shift in marginal behavior. New deals were structured differently. Long-term commitments shortened. Optionality increased. The center held, but its gravitational pull weakened. Another recurring element is time. Economic pressure rarely produces immediate strategic clarity. Its consequences accumulate slowly, dispersed across sectors and years. By the time patterns become visible, they are difficult to attribute to a single cause. This diffusion creates a sense of ambiguity that protects the initiator from recognizing the full impact of its actions. The absence of a clear breaking point encourages the belief that the strategy is costless. Fragility enters not through collapse, but through complexity. As systems fragment, coordination becomes harder, standards diverge, trust becomes conditional. The efficiency gains of a unified framework are replaced by the resilience of multiple overlapping ones. This trade-off is rational for participants managing risk, but it reduces the ability of any single actor to steer outcomes decisively. In this light, the pressure campaign can be seen as part of a broader historical sequence, rather than an isolated event. It reflects a moment when a dominant power chose to exercise leverage openly, confident in the system's capacity to absorb the strain. The system did absorb it, but absorption is not neutrality. It involved redistribution of incentives and the quiet encouragement of alternatives. The strategic mirror is clear in retrospect. Economic pressure can compel adjustment, but it also teaches lessons. It teaches those subject to it where vulnerabilities lie. It teaches them which dependencies are most dangerous. Over time, those lessons are encoded into policy and practice. The initiator may achieve short-term gains, but the system itself becomes less amenable to future pressure. This does not mean the strategy failed. Historically, such campaigns often succeed on their own terms. What they rarely do is preserve the environment in which they were effective. The more frequently economic leverage is used, the more actors invest in escaping it. This is the quiet paradox at the heart of structural power. Its exercise erodes the conditions that make it reliable. By the end of this phase, the outlines of change are visible to those who know where to look. The system still functions. Trade still flows. Influence still exists. But it rests on a narrower base of unquestioned acceptance. The pattern suggests that this narrowing, not any single policy outcome, is the lasting consequence of sustained economic pressure. The final stage of these shifts rarely announces itself. There is no ceremony marking the moment when leverage becomes less decisive, or when confidence gives way to caution. Instead, participants notice that outcomes feel less predictable than they once did. Measures that would previously have produced clear responses now yield mixed results. Negotiations take longer. Concessions arrive more slowly, if at all. The system still responds, but not with the same clarity. This is the point at which observers often describe change as sudden, even though it has been forming for years. The sensation of abruptness comes from delayed recognition rather than rapid transformation. Structural adjustments accumulate quietly until they intersect with an event that makes them visible. That event may be small in itself, but it reveals the underlying conditions. In monetary and trade systems, these moments are often misread as causes rather than catalysts. The deeper causes lie in the gradual redistribution of risk and agency that preceded them. Economic pressure campaigns contribute to this dynamic by altering expectations. Once actors internalize the possibility that access can be constrained, they behave differently even when no constraint is present. They shorten horizon, they diversify relationships, they treat efficiency as a secondary concern to resilience. These changes do not reverse when pressure eases. They persist because they are rooted in experience, not ideology. For ordinary people, the consequences of this adjustment appear indirectly. Prices fluctuate with greater sensitivity to external events. Employment becomes more exposed to shifts in supply chains that once felt stable. Companies hesitate before making long-term commitments, preferring flexibility over expansion. None of this feels like collapse. It feels like friction. Life continues, but with a sense that the ground is less firm than it used to be. Historically, this phase has been the most difficult to interpret. The absence of crisis encourages complacency, while the presence of strain creates unease without clarity. Policymakers and analysts debate indicators, searching for confirmation that the system remains fundamentally sound. Often it is. Soundness, however, is not permanence. Systems can function well even as their margins of safety narrow. The unpredictability of triggers compounds the confusion, because no one can say precisely when accumulated adjustments will intersect with stress. Attention shifts to short-term signals. Markets watch announcements. Commentators focus on negotiations. The deeper conditions remain in the background, shaping responses without being named. When disruption eventually arrives, it is experienced as shock, even though the system has been preparing for it all along. What distinguishes this moment from earlier ones is not the presence of pressure, but the awareness it has generated. Economic leverage, once used openly, cannot be unseen. Its demonstration changes the mental models of those who depend on the system. They no longer assume neutrality, they factor in contingency. This recalibration is subtle, but it is enduring. In past transitions, the lived experience of such recalibration has often preceded formal acknowledgement. People adapt before institutions explain why. They sense that arrangements once taken for granted now require monitoring. Trust becomes conditional, subject to review. This does not mean relationships dissolve. It means they are managed more carefully, with an eye toward potential reversal. The strategy behind sustained economic pressure thus reveals its most lasting effects here, in the realm of perception and behavior rather than policy statements. The system absorbs the immediate measures, but it also records them. That record informs future choices. Over time, the accumulation of such choices reshapes the environment in which pressure operates. Influence remains, but it is exercised within a more complex, less centralized landscape. For those living within that landscape, the change is gradual enough to be normalized. New frictions are accepted as the cost of doing business. Variability is incorporated into planning. The sense of a single, stable framework fades without disappearing entirely. This is how transitions are lived, not as dramatic breaks, but as adjustments that slowly redefine what stability feels like. By the time the consequences are widely recognized, they are often attributed to external forces or sudden shocks. The role of earlier decisions recedes into the background. History, however, suggests that these decisions matter most, not for what they achieved immediately, but for how they altered expectations. Economic pressure can secure concessions, but it also teaches systems how to function with less reliance on the source of that pressure. The realization that follows is quiet. It does not demand action or announce endings. It simply clarifies that the environment has changed. The strategy that once promised leverage now operates within narrower bounds. The system still works, but it works differently. Those who understand this do not look for dramatic failure. They recognize the signs of maturation and constraint that accompany the long arc of power. In this sense, the campaign's legacy is not a single outcome, but a shift in how economic relationships are understood. The tools remain available. The will to use them may persist. Yet, the context in which they are effective has been subtly reshaped. History records these moments not as defeats or victories, but as inflection points, where systems begin to behave in new ways long before anyone agrees on what that means.